NCC-1701. No bloody A, B, C, or D.
Program complete. Enter when ready.
One of the most significant spacecraft in science fiction history is the USS Enterprise from the original Star Trek. This beloved sci-fi classic spawned a sprawling franchise of over a dozen movies and nearly 1,000 episodes of TV spread across nearly 50 seasons. And in fact, a few of those seasons even revisit the original Enterprise with a modern twist. Today we are going to look at both the original series Enterprise and the Strange New Worlds/Discovery reimagining. I'm Joey from Radio Free Vulcan, and this is Every Enterprise Episode 2, A Tale of Two Starships. Kirk's Enterprise. Design. The Constitution-class heavy cruiser USS Enterprise NCC-1701 was a fairly standard design for mid-23rd century Starfleet. It had a large, saucer-shaped main hull attached to a tubular secondary hull with a thin, forward-leaning neck, and two long warp nacelles attached to the secondary hull by thin, outward-angled pylons. The saucer was topped by the bridge dome and had a sensor dome opposite this on the bottom. It was ringed with windows and had markings denoting various hatches and other points of interest, as well as the ship's name and registry number emblazoned on the front ahead of the bridge, and blinking formation lights at the sides. The ship's impulse drive assembly was located at the back of the saucer. The secondary hull featured the ship's deflector dish assembly at the front, and the large clamshell doors to the shuttle bay at the rear. Below the shuttle bay were a series of landing lights to guide shuttle pilots into the bay, and above it was the shuttle traffic control room. The nacelles were essentially the same format that Starfleet had used for the last 100 years, with a glowing Bussard collector to harvest interstellar particles at the front, two fin-like intercooler assemblies towards the rear, and the spherical Space Matrix Restoration Coil at the back. On the inside, the Enterprise had 21 decks. The main deck was on Deck 1 at the top, and the saucer section held Decks 1 through 10, in which you could find the computer core, officer, crew, and VIP quarters, offices, 14 science labs, the crew mess and lounge, recreation areas including a bowling alley, gym, and chapel, the security complex, the sickbay complex, and more. The neck covered decks 8 through 14, which were mostly filled with the structural Durasteel frame holding the two hull sections together, but also had the turbolifts between them and several small observation lounges. Decks 15 through 21 were in the secondary hull. Main engineering occupied several decks, and much of the rest of the space was filled with machinery, storage, fuel tanks, and engineering-related offices. The rear third of the secondary hull was occupied by the shuttle bay complex, which included a large landing bay with several elevated observation rooms, and an elevator into the shuttle storage below. In real life, the original Enterprise was created by Matt Jeffries. Specifications. The USS Enterprise measured 289 meters long by 144 meters wide and 67.6 meters tall, and had an estimated mass of 820,000 tons. Its cruising speed was warp factor 6, but it could safely sustain emergency speeds of warp 7 or even 8 for short periods of time. Warp 9 was possible as well, but doing so was prohibitively dangerous and reserved only for the most dire of emergencies. Warp speeds of 10 to 11 were also possible with modifications to the warp drive, but these speeds were extremely dangerous as the ship was not built with them in mind and was not structurally suitable for them. The maximum warp speed ever recorded by a Constitution-class starship was warp 14.1, which the Enterprise sustained for 15 minutes after the warp drive was sabotaged and overloaded, though the Enterprise also managed to reach Warp 22 when it attempted to tractor a ship traveling at Warp 36 and got dragged along for the ride. The Enterprise was not intended to be a warship, but it was well armed for defense against hostile aliens it might meet in deep space. The exact weapons loadout varied throughout the years, but its main weapons were 6 to 8 phaser beam banks located port, starboard, midship, and aft. These retracted into the hull when not in use. Each phaser consisted of a pair of spherical emitters that fired 2 parallel phaser beams, though they were also used independently to fire a single beam at a time on many occasions. These beams were typically blue, but could be other colors as well, possibly due to different energy frequencies or power levels. The phasers had a range of 90,000 kilometers. They were extremely versatile, and could also be used to destroy objects on a planet's surface or even be set to stun like a hand phaser for crowd control. The beam could be focused to wide or narrow for various purposes as well. Ship-mounted phasers were one of the most advanced weapon systems in the galaxy at the time. The Enterprise was also armed with 3 torpedo launchers, 2 on the underside of the saucer, and 1 at the stern in the engineering section fantail. These weapons were very powerful as well, with the ship carrying enough torpedoes to theoretically level every city on an average planet. Such an operation, General Order 24, was fortunately never tested by the Enterprise. A Constitution-class starship had a crew of 203 when initially launched, though this number would over-double to 428 over the next decade. Command staff included the Commanding Officer, First Officer, Chief Medical Officer, Chief Engineer, Science Officer, Helmsman, Navigator, Communications and Operations Officer, and Chief of Security. The officers in these positions changed many times throughout the history of the Enterprise. The original version of the Constitution class was equipped with several shuttlecraft. Throughout most of its history, the Enterprise carried 4 Class F shuttlecraft, the most famous of these being the Galileo. The Class F was a small rectangular transport with 2 warp nacelles at the bottom, a door on the port side, and 3 small windows at the front which could be covered by blast shutters to protect its occupant's vision if the sensors detected something hazardously bright. The shuttle measured 7.32 meters long by about 3.2 meters wide and 2.44 tall. It had a crew of 1 and could carry 6 passengers and a small amount of cargo. The Class F was equipped with a warp drive capable of reaching moderate warp speeds and keeping pace with a Constitution-class starship at warp, implying a top speed of warp 5 to 6. The Class F was not the only type of shuttle that could be found on the Enterprise, though. Throughout the animated series, the animated follow-up to the original series, we see several types of shuttles carried aboard the Enterprise. A long pointed model, an egg-shaped scout, a heavy shuttle, a tube-shaped shuttle, a scouter gig boat, and an aquashuttle. I suspect that most of these were the result of animators getting bored of drawing hundreds of frames of the Class F and opting for more visually distinct shuttles, as the Enterprise's shuttle bay already strains credulity in terms of fitting into the secondary hull without having to make room for numerous additional shuttles, many of which were much larger than the Class F. The only one of those whose associated plot points couldn't have been fulfilled by a Class F, as far as I can tell, is the Aquashuttle. This roughly 18-meter long by 11-meter wide and 3-meter tall shuttle was a combination spacecraft, boat, and submarine, being capable of underwater exploration and transport just as effectively as it could in space or in atmosphere. It required 2 crew and was armed with 3 phaser emitters. The Enterprise seemed to only carry 1 of these, as when it was destroyed by a sea monster, the crew had to use the scouting gig to search for it. Pikes Enterprise. Design and specifications. The Enterprise I have described to you thus far is the one seen in the Star Trek original series from 1966. However, in 2019, a new version of the Enterprise appeared in the second season of the uniquely controversial prequel series, Star Trek Discovery. Unlike previous new iterations of the Enterprise, this was a straight reinterpretation of that specific ship. Not a new starship of the same name like the Next Generation Enterprise, not a refit or remodel like the Motion Picture Enterprise as far as we know, and not an alternate universe redesign like the Star Trek 2009 Enterprise, as much as some fans wish it to be so. This Enterprise was simply a reinterpretation of the original idea to make the best use of modern filmmaking technology and match modern TV viewer expectations. Not necessarily a retcon per se, though it might be, but just a different look so that it wouldn't look out of place or outdated next to other starships of the Discovery era. That being said, there are still many aesthetic and structural differences that make the ship very different from the original. In fact, there is an urban legend among the Star Trek community, and even within the design staff of Discovery, that any new Enterprise must be 25% different to the original or it would be subject to copyright infringement. This is both untrue, as Paramount owns the rights to the original Enterprise with the rest of the Star Trek franchise and would only be suing itself, and unenforceable, because how do you quantify something looking 25% different? But 25% different the Disco Prize was, nonetheless. The biggest difference was the size. Many of the ships in Star Trek Discovery dwarfed the original Constitution class, especially the USS Discovery herself at a length of 750 meters, a size which would not be seen again in Starfleet for over a century, arguably. I'll come back to that. It was decided that for the Enterprise's guest appearance in Discovery's second season that it would have to be scaled up to match the other ships of the era. It would look absurd, almost disrespectful, to show the legendary original Enterprise so small next to the Discovery. Though much of the Discovery's footprint is negative space due to its unusually long warp nacelles, so maybe it wouldn't have been that bad. Why they chose to make all the Discovery ships so big in the first place is beyond me. On top of forcing them to upscale the Enterprise, it also undercuts the significance of the USS Excelsior in the Star Trek films, which is supposed to be the biggest ship Starfleet had ever built, but would fall squarely in the middle of the Disco fleet at only 20-some meters longer than the Disco Prize. On the other hand, though, there is substantial evidence that both the Excelsior and the original and refit Enterprises may be much larger than their stated sizes, potentially up to the size of the reimagined Enterprise, with the Excelsior coming out to somewhere in the 600 to 700 meter range. That is well outside the scope of this video though, so you will have to check out the article I read about it on xastrisscientia.org to find out more. In summary, while the original size of the Excelsior is likely correct, some details line up in a way that mean it could potentially be large enough that Dr. McCoy is still impressed when he sees it, even if he were used to seeing ships in the 300 to 500 meter range a couple decades before.
God, that's a big ship.
Not so big as her captain, I think.
Either way, though, I think it is simplest just to disregard the sizes of all the ships in Discovery and Strange New Worlds, especially the Enterprise. Anyway, now that I've talked about the size of almost every ship but the subject of this video, the Discovery version of the Enterprise measured 442 meters long by about 200 meters wide and 91 meters tall. Other than the size issue, it was a relatively faithful and extremely appealing reinterpretation of the Constitution-class design. It had roughly the same shape overall, with slightly shorter proportional height and steeper angles all around to give it a faster, more aggressive look, and better fill a widescreen TV or mobile device. It was also more detailed, with a complex hull texture and numerous hatches, ports, windows, and more that were not visible on the original model. The exact details varied, as the ship was slightly changed between Discovery Season 2 and its next appearance in Strange New Worlds Season 1, and then again in between the first two seasons of Strange New Worlds. The changes after Discovery come from a refit to repair battle damage, but the second round of changes seem to be just for fun. When I talk about the design changes, I will be referring to the latest version of Pikes Enterprise, though the differences between the 3 iterations are very minor. A curved neck here, lights around the deflector there, etc. The saucer section remained largely the same as the original series Enterprise, relatively speaking, but the bridge module was flattened out to be much less prominent, and a large window was added at the front of it. The 2 small impulse engines at the rear of the saucer were replaced with 2 banks of 3, and a small probe launcher or airlock was added between them. The neck was made much sturdier, and on the latest version of the design, given a subtle curve. The secondary hull was made much slimmer, with a more pronounced undercut at the rear and a longer fantail behind the shuttle bay. In the undercut were a large set of doors leading to the cargo bay. The deflector dish at the front had a ring of lights added around the base of it as well. The pylons were changed to match the shape of those on the refit Enterprise seen in the motion picture, albeit with a weird cutout in the middle. The warp nacelles were mostly the same as the original, though the rear end of them was based on the Enterprise as seen in the pilot episode of Star Trek, which had a grid of holes instead of the ball-shaped space matrix restoration coil seen in the rest of the show. We can assume it probably does the same function, though. They also had NX-style flux chiller assemblies running along the inward sides of the nacelles. In real life, Pikes Enterprise was designed primarily by John Eaves, Scott Schneider, and William Budge. Pikes Enterprise had a very similar weapons layout and crew complement to Kirk's Enterprise, the original, but where it differed was the embarked shuttlecraft. Originally, it carried a complement of several Class C shuttlecraft. These were large, angular shuttles with a prominent airlock at the rear, and seating for 2 pilots and 12 passengers. They measured about 13 meters long by 5¼ meters wide and 3½ meters tall. They were equipped with a transporter pad, making them almost certainly the smallest ship to carry one at the time. It had a ventral launch bay to deploy small probes, and could be upgraded to add phasers with an apparatus attached to the sides of the rear section of the shuttle. It was capable of warp flight, though its maximum speed was unknown. They appear to be the progenitor of the line of shuttles first seen in the original Star Trek movies, then later on in The Next Generation, Voyager, and beyond, with most of the shuttles in those having a very similar design to the Class C, though most were much smaller. Later on in Pike's command of the Enterprise, the Class Cs were seemingly replaced with an as-yet unnamed model of shuttle. It is possible that this shuttle is simply a reimagining of the Class F like Pikes Enterprise, but it is substantially larger than the Class F. Almost double the size, in fact, at around 14 meters long by 8.7 meters wide and 4 tall. It was crewed by a pilot and navigator, and could carry 6 to 8 passengers and some cargo. It, too, was fitted with a transporter, though this was primarily saved for emergencies. EV suits for the crew and passengers were stored aboard the shuttle for use in space or hostile environments. It was unarmed but equipped with a small tractor beam projector. Like the Class C, we don't know what its warp speed was, only that it was capable of warp flight. History. The history of the Enterprise is well documented through Star Trek Discovery, Strange New Worlds, the original series, and the animated series, but I will run you through the greatest hits anyway. The Enterprise was one of 12 original Constitution-class starships built in the early to mid-23rd century. Its components were built on Earth and assembled in orbit at the San Francisco Fleet Yards. Construction was overseen by Captain Robert April, who would become its commanding officer when it launched. His wife Susan personally designed several of the tools used in its sickbay, Dr. Richard Daystrom designed its computer system, and its warp engines were designed by Larry Marvick, who would later become its chief engineer during April's time in command. The Enterprise was launched on April 11th, 2245, with Robert April as captain, Christopher Pike as first officer, Sarah April as chief medical officer, Una Chin Riley as chief science officer, and Larry Marvick as chief engineer. April commanded the Enterprise for 5 years, during which time he violated the Prime Directive no less than 3 times. After his 5-year mission, April was promoted to Commodore in 2250, and command passed to Pike. Pike promoted Chin Riley to first officer, and took on all new staff including Louvier, then later Hemmer, and later still Pelia as chief engineer, Phil Boyce, and later Joseph Mbenga as chief medical officer, Erica Ortegas as helmsman, Nyota Uhura as communications officer, Jose Tyler and later Jamila Amin as navigator, Jenna Mitchell as operations officer, Spock as science officer, and Lan Noonien Singh as chief of security. During Pike's time in command, the Enterprise undertook 2 5-year exploration missions, one of which deliberately kept them out of the Federation-Klingon War, either to protect the best of Starfleet, or to keep Pike from reminding Starfleet of Federation values during the war, depending on who you ask. After the war, the Enterprise was dispatched to find the source of several unknown signals. En route to the first investigation, it suffered a catastrophic system failure due to faulty communication systems, and had to be towed back to space dock for repairs. Pike briefly took command of the USS Discovery for this mission, which led to the Enterprise being called upon later to help Discovery fight a fleet of ships being controlled by a rogue Section 31 AI that wanted to use information stored aboard the Discovery to become sentient and wipe out all organic life in the galaxy. After this battle, and a roughly 1-year break, the Enterprise was sent out on its next 5-year mission, where it made first contact with numerous species, fought several battles, foiled a false flag attack, resolved at least 3 time travel incidents, and made countless scientific discoveries, including that of a quantum uncertainty field that caused uncontrollable singing in all who encountered it. In 2265, after 15 years of commanding the Enterprise, Pike was promoted to fleet captain, and command of the Enterprise was passed to perhaps the most famous captain in Starfleet history, James T. Kirk. Spock continued to serve as science officer, but was promoted to first officer as well. Montgomery Scott came on as chief engineer at some point, possibly during Pike's tenure. Dr. Mbenga was replaced by Leonard McCoy, and Hikaru Sulu became the helmsman. Uhura stayed on as communications officer, and took on the role of operations officer as well. Kirk's Enterprise had many navigators, but the most significant of them was Pavel Chekhov, who also served intermittently as the tactical officer, which Sulu did as well. Under Kirk, the Enterprise completed an additional 5-year mission. Like Pike, Kirk and company made countless discoveries and first contacts, negotiated diplomatic treaties, and even time traveled. They battled the Klingons and Romulans several times, and even had to fight a planet-killing superweapon called the Doomsday Machine, and at one point were hijacked by a new M5 multitronic computer being tested aboard the Enterprise by Dr. Daystrom. It was one of the most eventful and successful 5-year missions ever conducted by a Starfleet vessel. Afterward, in the 2270s, the Enterprise underwent an 18-month refit into the new Constitution II class, but that will be a topic for another time. And that is everything there is to know about the original Enterprise and the modern reimagining of it. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the 2 versions of this starship. Let me know in the comments what you thought and which version you prefer. Like the video as well, and subscribe for more Star Trek and Star Wars content. But that's it for me, so I will see you next time. RFC, out.